Welcome back to Into the Word and a big picture of the Old Testament. Today we'll cover a big picture of the books of Exodus and Leviticus. Sometimes things in life don't start with great success. Before making motorcycles, Soichiro Honda, the founder of the Honda motorcycle company, had started a number of different businesses without any success. As a matter of fact, he once described his life as nothing but mistakes, a series of failures, a series of regrets. But he credited those failures to his success. He said, "Success can be achieved only through repeated failure and introspection. In fact, success represents 1% of your work and results from the 99% that is called failure." As we look at Exodus through Deuteronomy in this session and the next, we don't really see a success story. God delivered the people of Israel out of Egypt in a very powerful way, but as he led the people of Israel through the desert, the Israelites turned against God. God then decided that that generation would not enter into the promised land. Before he led the next generation into the promised land, God reestablished the covenant with the Israelites. Exodus is actually a continuation of the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, we saw the beginning of the universe, the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity, and the beginning of the Jewish people. In the book of Exodus, we see the beginning of the Jewish people as a nation. Exodus continues where Genesis actually left off. In the first 7 verses, we get an overview that actually covers 400 years. Exodus chapter 1 verse 7 tells us that the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. The Egyptians were really threatened by this and had by then enslaved the Israelites. We have to remember the promises God had made to Abraham in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis. There were 2 promises God had made to Abraham. The first one was that his descendants would be as numerous as the sand on the sea. The second was that he would give these descendants a land to live in. So as we start the book of Exodus, we see that the first promise was actually fulfilled. There were a lot of Israelites. But the second promise was not yet fulfilled. They did not yet have a land to live in because they lived as slaves in the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 2 verses 1 through 10 tells us that the Israelite population kept on growing. The Pharaoh then instructed the Israelite midwives to kill every baby boy that was born to the Israelites. Somehow, through a set of circumstances, a little baby boy named Moses was saved from this, and he ended up growing up in the palace. As an adult, Moses actually killed an Egyptian, and he had to flee for his life. He ended up living in the desert, taking care of sheep for 40 years. Exodus 2:23 tells us that during this time, the king of Egypt died. So during this time that Moses lived in the desert, during this time that he got married and had 2 sons, the king of Egypt died. During this time, of course, the Israelites were still living in slavery, and they started to cry out to God. God then called Moses through the burning bush to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. Before Pharaoh let the Israelites go, God had to bring 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. These were not just a demonstration of God's power, they were also a demonstration against the gods of the Egyptians. For example, for the Egyptians, the river Nile was the god Hapi and the source of life. God turned the water of the Nile into blood and therefore showed that he was really the source of life and that he was more powerful than the god Hapi. The Egyptians also worshipped the sun as the god Re or Amun-Re. God brought darkness upon the land of Egypt to show that he was more powerful than the sun god. In the last plague, God brought death upon the firstborns of the Egyptians. Through this, he showed that he ultimately had all the power over life and death. God also gave Moses instructions for building a tabernacle. You see a picture here of the reconstruction of the tabernacle. The tabernacle was to symbolically provide a place for God to live among his people. It was also the place where priests offered sacrifices to God. Exodus chapters 25 through 31 give detailed instructions on how the Israelites had to build the tabernacle. Chapters 25 through 39 tell us how Moses and the Israelites followed those instructions in detail. In chapter 40, Exodus closes with an emphasis that the people completed the tabernacle as the Lord had commanded Moses. That brings us to the book of Leviticus, which is instructions about holy living. Exodus ends with where the Israelites were to worship God, which was in the tabernacle. The book of Leviticus is really about how they were to worship God and how they were to live together as a community. A big part of worship for the Israelites back then was bringing animal sacrifices to God. Now, for most of us, that may seem strange because we don't live in any culture where we sacrifice animals to God. But for the Israelites, this was not really a strange thing. Most of the people, if not all of the people who lived around them, worshiped their gods through the sacrifice of animals. But we have to understand that for the Israelites, this had a totally different meaning. First of all, Israelites did not sacrifice animals to know the will of God or to know the future. Some tribes or some nations around the Israelites did this. For example, Mesopotamians brought sacrifices to their God in order to know the future. What they would do was they would bring a sacrifice, an animal, they would cut open the animal, and then they would look at the insides to detect or to see a message from their God for the future. Secondly, Israel's sacrificial worship was linked to the covenant relationship with God. This was unique to the Israelites. None of the people who surrounded the Israelites had any type of covenant relationship with their gods. Third, an important aspect of the sacrificial worship system toward God for the Israelites was the fact that God is holy. The holiness of God refers to the moral and ethical nature of God. Holy also means that God is totally separate. He is totally different from the God of the pagan nations around the Israelites. Those pagan nations had absolutely no concept that their gods were holy. As a matter of fact, their gods were very immoral and very corrupt. So even though many people at that time worshipped their gods by sacrificing animals, for the Israelites this had a totally different meaning. The first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus describe the 5 different sacrifices Israelites could bring. Those sacrifices were the burnt offering, the grain or cereal offering, the fellowship or peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. So in the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 7 covers the different sacrifices. Chapters 8 through 10 is about conditions for the priesthood. Chapters 11 through 16 describes what is acceptable worship to God. Chapters 17 through 27 is what is known as the Holiness Code. These are a set of laws that God gave to the Israelites to instruct them on how to live together as a community. One important feast that comes up in the book of Leviticus that we haven't covered yet is the Day of Atonement. This was one of the most important and one of the most sacred days for Israelites in the Old Testament. On the Day of Atonement, people were able to receive forgiveness for any sins that were not covered through any of the animal sacrifices throughout the year. So the book of Leviticus really covers what kind of sacrifices the Israelites had to bring to God, but it also covers how the Israelites were to live together as a community and how they were to treat each other as a people. Living the way God wants us to live isn't just about going to church on Sunday, lifting our hands in worship, and putting some money in the offering. Living a godly life is about how we treat other people. It's about how we treat our neighbors, how we treat people at work, how we treat the server at the restaurant, the poor, the elderly, widows, and orphans. It's about how we treat each other. So that brings us to the end of Leviticus. In the next session, we will finish the Pentateuch by looking at Numbers and Deuteronomy. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.